This is episode 2 of a brand new show, Who's Better Baseball, where we answer a simple question. Who's better at baseball? I'm your host, Ryan Finkelstein. I got Colby Olson here. I had you on because at Just Baseball, you are a resident Red Sox guy. I know no one knows Xander Bogaerts like you, and today it's all about Bogaerts and Dansby Swanson. And I just wrote this article, Who's Better, Dansby Swanson, Xander Bogaerts, for justbaseball.com, which we will have linked in the description. I had a lot of fun with this one. On the surface, and I say it so many times throughout writing this, there's no question that Xander Bogaerts has been the better shortstop. As a guy that's been doing a lot of Lindor coverage the last few years, any sample size you want to look, whether it is go back to 2015, 2017, 2019, there's always two shortstops atop the F4 leaderboards. It's Lindor, and always behind him, it's Bogaerts. He's been amazing. Where this conversation gets interesting is as we project forward, because Dansby Swanson, over the last year and a half, really has turned himself into a top 5 shortstop in baseball, arguably. And Bogaerts has always been there. So, first off, what was even before you read my article, what was your kind of gut reaction? Bogaerts, Swanson, where were you at?
In terms of future outlook, I think it's tough because these players they both have question marks surrounding them moving forward, right? For Dansby Swanson, this is a player that, as you mentioned, just really came onto the scene, right? Since 2016, 9.8 F4. Xander Bogaerts, 23.4 F4 since 2016. Completely different players before 2022, but things changed, right? Dansby had a 6.4 WAR season, and his defense completely changed. And one thing I looked into is the Ron Washington effect, actually. So Ron Washington, third base coach for the Braves now, defensive guru, and he had nothing but good things to say about Dansby. But what he did say is Dansby is not an athletic freak by any means. He doesn't have a stronger arm than anybody. He's not faster than the average shortstop, right? But he makes all the plays. And after watching some tape, you see that he's insanely good at coming in on the ball, charging the ball, really fluid glove. But if you look on Savant, the biggest increase for Dansby last season was on his backhanded plays. So definitely an improvement in range. And that is where Xander Bogaerts is lacking in range, right? Defensively. And then if you move over to the bat, Ryan, just talk about the bat, right? Xander Bogaerts this season had an amazing season, right? He hit 307, but all of the expected metrics you look at, WOBA was 363, but his xWOBA was 323. His expected batting average was down, 259, and he hit 307. So that's somewhat concerning to me when you look at a guy that had one of his lowest hard hit rates of his career, lowest barrel percentages, lowest home run to fly ball rates. Going into an age 30 season, does that concern you at all about Xander Bogaerts, whether he can continue to do damage to the ball? Is that something that you're worried about?
I think with Bogaerts and another free agent, JD Martinez, I wonder what you do when you take those longtime Red Sox out of Fenway. If they're still with the Red Sox, I think they can continue to hit for a high average, but it's just that crutch of the monster of being able to, hit a fly ball out to left field and get a double, and, being able to have that. But, at the end of the day, I think that Bogaerts, like you look at the thing that I always kind of go to first when I'm trying to see about a regression on a player is the strikeouts. Like, are they suddenly not competitive in their at-bats? And this year, Bogaerts, his strikeout and his walk rates were within half a point of his career line. So I looked at that and I said, even though I could try to make an argument in favor of Swanson by predicting a regression offensively for Bogaerts, I still think he's just too good of a hitter. And I know we see the expected batting average, but again, he still hit 295. I think that offensively, we look at the 6 seasons since Swanson has come up and you compare the two, there is no comparison. I mean, you look at the better strikeout rate for Bogaerts, the better walk rate, the WRC plus is 127 over a 6-year span. Swanson, it's 93. The F4, 10 wins more for Bogaerts. Like every offense statistic, we go to Bogaerts' favor. But to me, it's how closely can Swanson beat a Bogaerts moving forward? And what he's been the last 2 seasons is a Gold Glove type shortstop who did just win a Gold Glove, who's hit 25 homers. That's kind of the differentiator. It's how closely can we get these two? I think moving forward, I still like it's 1 year of Swanson being above average offensive, like really, really above average this year. And even then, it was what, a 118 WRC plus this year, or 116 actually, where
Yeah,
Bogaerts
116.
Bogaerts is 134. So moving forward, I still think that Bogaerts has the bat, but it's how closely can we get? Because if we get them relatively close, like it was this year, well, then look, the glove put Swanson ahead of him in F4 this season.
Yeah, and I still think that there is another step that Dansby can take forward at the plate. The problem with Dansby is he just doesn't walk enough, right?
Yeah.
A 7% walk rate is not going to cut it when you're striking out 26% of the time. But we did see the power numbers shine through a little bit more for Dansby this year. He hit 25 home runs, but he had the highest hard hit rate of his career. I think that there is another step forward for Dansby, but you're right. I think it's fair to wonder if Xander was injured this season, whether he was dealing with something lingering. You just don't know what is always going on with these players. One comp that I want to bring up with you about Dansby Swanson is Trevor Story, because you look at them going into free agency. Trevor Story was a glove first shortstop for, in reality, right? He hit at Coors, so his numbers were a little bit inflated, but you look at 2019, he had a 122 WRC plus, 128 WRC plus in 2018 with amazing defense. And you look at the contract that Trevor Story got, 6 years, 140 million, 23 million a year. And if you look at Jack's article on justbaseball.com, he kind of has a similar price range for Dansby Swanson. I think it was 7 years, 158 million, which is right there, 23 million a year. So do you think that's a fair comp for kind of what Dansby will get? And honestly, how Dansby performs as a player? I think it's somewhat similar to Trevor Story, and where he's a above average hitter, but really elite with the glove.
I think that actually makes a lot of sense. And I think the interesting dynamic when it comes to the contract, I actually had this line in my article. I said, teams are literally going to be betting hundreds of millions of dollars on the notion that Swanson is the guy that he was in 2022, not who he was previously. Interestingly enough, with Story, it was betting on him being the guy he was prior to his contract year. If we had this conversation 2 years ago, it would have been ludicrous to say, is Swanson, on the same level as Trevor freaking Story? There's just no chance. But that's the crazy thing about baseball. Swanson goes out, he hits 52 home runs over the last 2 years. He leads the league in outs above average outside of whatever happened with Jonathan Scope. But he was the best shortstop.
Explain that one to me.
It doesn't make sense. So, I think you can make the argument that Swanson this year was the best defender in baseball. And moving forward, you look at a hitter that has had a better ISO over the last 2 years than Bogaerts, is hitting home runs, seems to be tracking up. And the other thing I think is interesting about these two guys is, one of the layers of my article was who's more durable. And they're both extremely durable. I think that's something that each of them takes into free agency, where any team that signs them, that's not a question. Even if you're signing Aaron Judge, you're thinking a little bit about health. These guys, the only shortstop who's played more games than them is Lindor, since Swanson was a full-time shortstop. Identical amount of games played, 789. But the interesting thing to me is it feels like Bogaerts is like 3 years older than Swanson, because he debuted at 20, as you know, has been around forever and has an additional, I think it was 400 more games. So he has so much more tread in his tires. But I guess that's my question to you here is, are we seeing a regression of a player that's just been in the big leagues for a long time? Or is this like a 1 year thing? He just turned 30. He's literally a year older than Swanson.
Yeah.
I feel like they could age very similarly, but it does almost feel like you're getting a younger player with more left in the tank with Swanson.
Yeah, you're getting a player. Dansby is almost a year and a half younger, but I don't think it really matters when they debuted, because regardless, you're going to be playing a ton, whether it's in the minor leagues, whether you're playing college ball like Dansby did, you're going to be playing a ton of baseball. So aging wise, I think the next question with Xander Bogaerts is, does he stick at shortstop? I know that you wanted to frame this as if he's going to stick at shortstop for the long term, but it might help Xander if he does move to third base from a health perspective as well. I think whatever team Xander does go to, whether he does stay with the Red Sox, is they're going to have a plan to work him in at DH at times just to make sure he is healthy, because you want that bat in the lineup as much as possible. And the glove is negligible, especially with the shift rules changing next year. And I think that's another thing that would be interesting to talk about, because you mentioned this in your article as well as my article, is Xander Bogaerts last season was an above average defender, but not necessarily at shortstop, right? Because when he was shifted over to second base or shifted over to third base, that's where he actually got a lot of his outs above average. And at shortstop, he was -1 outs above average, right? So, I still think they're going to find creative ways, regardless of the shift being implemented. They're going to shift him up the middle, just not over second base. They're going to find ways to get him in good spots, but I think it does impact his defensive performance going forward.
Yeah, I'm glad you led me right to it, because that's where I was going to go next here. And you had this tweet in your free agent profile on Xander that I used in my article as well. Like you said, -1 outs above average at short, +5 at second base, +1 at third. You look at their careers, and it's -35 outs above average for Bogaerts on his career, and he was +5 this year. I looked at what he was from I think it was 16 through 2021 when they first started to look at outs above average, and only Didi Gregorius was a worse defensive shortstop in baseball than Xander was. He was -41 outs above average. Didi -71. And he still was playing shortstop at the beginning of last year. I cannot believe it. But
with a 90 WRC plus or something worse than
horrible,
that.
Horrible. Whatever. Joe Girardi must have loved him some Didi. But yeah, you look at Bogaerts, and it's every year it was below average until this season. I think he was good enough this year that as a free agent, he could demand to play shortstop moving forward. But any team that I think is signing him has to be thinking, okay, who's our shortstop prospect that's good enough that we can eventually push him off the position? If the Cubs sign him, are they really going to shift Nico Horner to second base for a year or two until, I guess, ego subsides enough to say, look, Nico's the better shortstop? That's the thing here. That's the only reason why this is a conversation, is because I don't think Bogaerts should be a shortstop really as soon as next season, but certainly not beyond, 2024, when we get to him being 32 years old. How is he going to fare at that position?
I think that's a little aggressive. I think by the time that Bogaerts, say he signs a 6-year deal, I think for the first 3 years of that contract, he will be able to play shortstop. Obviously not at an elite level. He's never been an elite shortstop. He's always been a Derek Jeter type of shortstop, right?
Yeah.
He's a guy that will make all the plays in front of him, all the good throws, right? He doesn't make many throwing errors, but he's not going to have the range to get to those extra balls. And that's the problem with Xander Bogaerts, that, a Dansby, he is going to get to those extra balls. But I don't know if that really decides. Like, I would want to sign Xander Bogaerts and put him at shortstop just because the bat is going to be so much better.
Yeah.
Moving forward, I think.
That's the thing. I think it's, let's just, because I don't even have to really make the case for Swanson defensively, but just to throw the numbers out: 38 outs above average in his career, 21 this past season. But before that, outside of his rookie season, he graded out above average every year. Not elite, but certainly a well above average shortstop. And he became elite this season. I think this shift plays a big part of this, in that if I'm to make the argument for Swanson, the reason why I'd want to sign him is thinking that I want to solidify that position. If I have no shortstop prospects that I see in the next 5 years making an impact, and I want to sign a guy where I don't have to think about shortstop in a shiftless world moving forward, that's where I would lean towards Swanson. But if I have other contingency plans at shortstop, I'm comfortable with making Bogaerts my shortstop, knowing that he can be hopefully a league average shortstop for a couple of years. And then at some point you can move him off the position. I think that's just the difference here. But if I had to spend $150 million plus, because Bogaerts probably costs a little bit more on either of these, as I was writing that check, I think it'd be hard for me to actually think, wait a minute, this is the same Dansby Swanson, right? From a year ago, who we never would have signed for close to $200 million. Never. And Bogaerts has always been a guy that was due to make this type of money.
Yeah. I think you're right there that Bogaerts is gonna demand, he's a Scott Boras guy. He's gonna demand $30 million is probably the floor there. I think that's like the asking price right now, especially with the amount of interest, right? Red Sox are obviously in the hunt. Padres, the Yankees just came out, whatever rumor that was yesterday or 2 days ago, right? If they lose Judge, we're going for Bogaerts. The Phillies have been in on Bogaerts. There's so many teams going after Bogaerts, and Boras is just there like, it just keeps getting higher. The price just keeps getting higher. But going back to Dansby for a second, because just going back to the defense real quick, is the change that Dansby made is so interesting because from 2018 through 2020, laterally towards third base, so going to your backhand, he was worth 3 outs above average. Then in 2021, -2 outs above average going towards his backhand. Last year, 12 outs above average going to your backhand. It has to be a Ron Washington thing. I don't know what it was that he figured out there, whether it's a footwork thing, because like I said, Dansby Swanson is not some freak athlete. I wonder what the change is there that really, really sparked that backhand leap.
Yeah. No, because that's, I mean, and the backhand becomes even more important without the shift. And we were just imagining, having to play him up the middle a little bit more, but still having that hole to cover. Yeah, I think that's just a differentiating factor is the two things I'm wondering most right now when it comes to the shift in free agency is, how do teams sort of value a second baseman differently now and a shortstop, the guys up the middle, and then how do like left-handed bats maybe fare where a team's more likely to take a shot on a Joey Gallo because there's no shift. Like I think these are the things that we don't know how the game's going to be played differently without the shift. And I think this is a perfect test case of the decisions that teams are going to have to make right now because of it. It's tough. Here's what I'm going to lay out to you. $180 million is the price tag for Bogaerts on a 6-year deal. So we're saying 30 million over 6. If I can give you for the same amount of money 2 additional years of Dansby Swanson, so an 8-year deal for 180, 22.5 million per season. So you're saving $7.5 million AAV. You're getting 2 extra years of control, whether that's a good or a bad thing on Dansby Swanson, who's a year and a half younger. Which player are you taking, Colby?
I think I'm gonna take Bogaerts.
Yeah.
Just because I don't know what an age 33 Dansby Swanson will look like at the plate or even defensively, right? He is not a freak athlete. He's playing really, really well defensively right now as a 28-year-old. And I don't see that stopping anytime soon, but I don't know if I'm comfortable laying out 8 years for Dansby Swanson, even at that lower AAV, right? Because that's what, it would be close to like $22-23 million.
Yeah, it's 22 and a half. Yeah.
I just don't know if I'm a team that is going to be signing either one of these guys. The expectation would be that I'm going over the cap or over the luxury tax, right? So the extra $7 million that I'm spending on Bogaerts is probably not going to matter much. What can I actually get for that $7 million? I think it's got to be signing Xander Bogaerts. And one case to be made here is you look at Steamer projections for next year. Zip's projections are probably going to say the same thing, right? Steamer has Bogaerts next year at 4.5 WAR, a 122 WRC plus. Steamer has Dansby right now at 3.2 WAR, a 104 WRC plus. So the projection systems don't love Dansby next year. They expect a big BABIP decrease. They have him rate at 247 average. That seems a little aggressive, and projection systems are, historically conservative, but that just kind of gives you a taste of there is still a gap for right now between Dansby and Xander.
It's so funny because of how numbers can kind of sway us a certain way. When I wrote this article, I was a little cute with my description at the end, where my verdict was that Dansby Swanson is the better free agent shortstop because I don't think that Bogaerts is going to be a shortstop very long beyond this. But I also in there wrote that the better player has been Bogaerts, and I think he probably will continue to be the better player. So I kind of copped out with the way I wrote it, but it's also funny because talk to me a year ago as the guy with the Met stuff behind me. I was not at all a proponent of Dansby Swanson. I thought that him and Ozzy Albies were the most overrated double play combination in baseball. And don't even get me started on Ozzy Albies. But I didn't see it for a long time. I know Peter had the take that Dansby Swanson was like your baseline of an average shortstop. And I had said something similar, that I felt like defensively he was good, but wasn't great. And offensively, he was just going to be like right in the middle. This year, he wasn't that. He was better. And I think that, he very much has the potential to make us all eat our words and be the better shortstop and be a top 5 shortstop in baseball for 5 years. But that is way less likely than Xander Bogaerts just still being awesome for 5 years, because he's been awesome his entire career.
I mean, I think there's a very likely outcome here where both of these contracts end up being fine.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I think there's also a reality where Dansby Swanson could really improve at the plate. Going back to his hard hit rate, 46% last year. He was, in 3 years before that, right around 41, 42%. But there definitely was, something that changed in his offensive profile last year. He's always been a fly ball guy. So you can always count on him being a 25 to 30 home run guy, I think, unless he goes to Detroit and then you're screwed. But, I would love to see Dansby in Fenway Park, if we're being honest. That would be quite intriguing. I think going back to your contract question for a second too, I might take Dansby at the Trevor Story number, 6 for 140, over Bogaerts at 6 for 180.
Okay. All right. So what's the math on? I'm gonna do this real quick. We got 140 by so 23.3. So right there. Yeah, I think that's, and then not having to be attached to him for 8 years, obviously.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like that. I think that's interesting, and then it's so tough for these teams to make these decisions. I think the bottom line here is you have 4 great shortstops on the market. I think that, Trey Turner and Carlos Correa are clearly a slight tier ahead of these two, but these are 2 guys that any team can sign this offseason and say, getting back to the durability, even they're going to be out there every day. And so almost every single day throughout a full season, you're going to have an advantage at shortstop most times with these guys. So that makes them a worthwhile investment. There's no wrong answer, but I think we've settled on Bogaerts being better, but we've left the window open for Swanson to
Yeah. You know what's weird? We've heard so much interest about Bogaerts, right? It seems like every team wants Xander Bogaerts on their team, and I haven't heard anything and not one rumor about Dansby Swanson yet.
I think he's the last shortstop to sign. I think, unless the Braves, I think what could happen is he could be, there's also a chance that Swanson isn't opening himself up to the market either. I mean, we could see he could be like,
He has
I
no
want to be a
reason to.
Brave.
He should let Story and Correa start that market.
Yeah, if they're, and because what could happen is the bidding can get out of control for those. I also could see like Bogart sign first, kind of like Seager did last year, where we're like Bogarts just got what, and then maybe he gets the biggest offer, like AAV wise, on the table as everything else kind of settles. But yeah, it's I'm so excited for the winter meetings to start, because one of these dominoes has to fall at the winter meetings, and it might just be Bogaerts. And then we'll see kind of where the market is and who still needs a shortstop after this. It seems like the Phillies will add a shortstop. It kind of seems like the Cubs might add a shortstop. And beyond that, I think all of these teams that could be losing these shortstops, the Dodgers, the Red Sox, the Braves, the Twins theoretically, if they hang on to Correa, they could all be in on these guys too. So it's the story of the offseason. As much as Judge the top tier free agent, the shortstops, I think, is what's the most important thing this year.
It feels a bit like a game of musical chairs where there's 4 really good shortstops and there's about 6 to 7 teams that kind of need a shortstop.
Yeah.
There's going to be people that are upset when they miss out.
That's for sure, because I think I did the top 5 shortstops for just baseball, and a little bit of a drop off when you get to Elvis Andrus. As great as he was this year, a slight drop off.
Yeah, 36-year-old Elvis Andrus might not be comparable to Dansby Swanson. I'll give you that.
That was the second edition of Who's Better. Thank you, Colby, for being my first guest. We will continue these throughout the offseason. A lot of free agent discussions to get to, a lot of comparisons that can be had. So we're going to keep things rolling with Who's Better Baseball.